Hey there everybody, thanks for joining me for this video. I hope you all had a great weekend. I hope you're enjoying this beautiful February weather. We're going to do our lesson today out of session 1 in the New Lifeway book, and it's entitled Courage. The text is Matthew 14 verses 22 through 33. Now this is a passage that most of us are probably at least somewhat familiar with. It's Jesus walking on the water. And the story is recorded in 3 of the Gospels. Matthew 14, 22, 33, which is our text. Mark 6, 45 through 42, and then John 6, 16 through 21. We're going to dig into a little bit of all of them. So now, moving on, before I get into the meat and potatoes of a lesson, I always like to give some context. I like to give a little backstory about what's going on, what are we reading about. In this case, we're coming on the heels of Jesus delivering his sermon of parables. And after that, he went into his own hometown of Nazareth, where he was rejected by the people who had known him all of his life. And after that comes the beheading of John the Baptist by Herod. And after Jesus was told of John's death, he got in a boat and he headed off alone. But the people heard, and they went on foot to where he was. And we're told that when they found him, Jesus had compassion on them. Even though he was dealing with a lot, he had compassion, he healed them, he fed them miraculously. And that's kind of where we're going to pick up in the story. Now, John 6 gives us more detail about what is happening here. So I'm going to start reading in John 6, verse 12. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." So we're talking about the miraculous feeding of the 5,000 plus women and children, makes it maybe 10, 15,000 people. We all are familiar with that story. But here's what happens next. This is in verse 15. Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. He's just trying to get off by himself, and this stuff keeps coming up. But he always helps. He always feels compassion, and he heals, and he feeds. But he's going to up the mountain for his alone time, and he realizes that these people are going to take him and they're going to force him to be king. They are ready to get rid of the Romans, and they are going to by force just make him be their king. So I'll jump off here in my class and talk about this just for a minute. And John explains to us that all these people had witnessed this incredible miracle, but they came away with the wrong idea of who Jesus is. They were concerned with their political climate. They were not concerned with the eternal climate. And we see the same thing today. So some of the stuff that I'll kind of talk about is this. This is a question I'll raise to my class. Do you think that this is another temptation of Jesus, similar to the devil offering all the kingdoms of the world? And then where we're kind of going into our lesson here, do you think that the disciples thought this was the moment of conquest by the king? He had all these people who were going to try to make him king. Do you think the disciples are going, "Oh, this is it, the time has come"? Was there a temptation for them as well? So moving on, leaving the crowds here, when they leave, this kind of marks the moment when disillusionment hits Jesus' followers. From here, Jesus is going to speak to the crowds less and less, and withdraw into the 12 more and more. And the disciples themselves, they're at a crossroads here. There's a lot going on. So from there, Jesus made his disciples get into the only boat. There's one boat there. He makes them get into it and head out across the lake. And Matthew uses the word in Matthew's gospel. He uses the word anankazo. He compelled them. It means he forced them. Jesus forced them to get in the boat and go to the other side. And then he went up to the mountain to pray. So the disciples now are separated from Jesus. So I'm going to read 3 different accounts here out of all 3 different gospels. Matthew 14, when evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was a long way from land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. All right, I'm going to read John 6, 18. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. And then Mark 6, 47, when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. There's a separation now. Jesus is on the mountain. These guys are in a windstorm on the lake, on the sea, fighting a headwind, and they don't have Jesus with them. They're on the Sea of Galilee. or also known as the Lake Gennesaret or the Sea of Tiberias. But don't let the name fool you. It's just a big freshwater lake. Interestingly, its surface area is about the same size as Lake Ouachita, but its shape is a lot different. It's mostly round in shape, and it doesn't have all the coves and arms and islands like Ouachita has. It's fed by the Jordan River, which comes in from the north, flows through the Sea of Galilee there, and then passes on south into the Dead Sea. They're on a journey where they're going to go about 4 or 5 miles. They're just going to cut off, and maybe as far as 10, depending on, different people have different thoughts on that. But they're really just going to cut off the northern side of the lake. Not a big, long journey. And these guys are fishermen. Most of these guys have fished this lake their whole lives. So it's not a big deal. But for the wind hits them, and all the Gospels record that there's a headwind blowing against them, and they rowed all night long into the fourth watch, which is about 3 to 6 a.m. Now, if you've ever been out on the water in a storm and in high winds, it is not fun. Now, imagine it's nighttime. And so you can imagine these guys are feeling some trepidation, some fear. And that's what's going to take us into the Lifeway lesson, because the lesson is on courage. And I don't think you can talk about courage unless you talk about fear. So I've got a couple of quotes for you on the subject of courage. Here's the first one. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face it and walk through it. All right, here's another one. This one's from FDR. Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the assessment that something else is more important than fear. And I believe FDR got that quote right, even if he maybe didn't have the more important something correct. I think he might have had that wrong. So that's kind of what we're going to delve into. So here's my first question. Why did Jesus send the guys without him? Why not go with them? A couple of reasons, but I think the main reason is this. I think it's teaching, and I think it's preparation. I think courage was the lesson that Jesus was teaching these guys. Because true courage, and this is where we're all going with this, true courage comes from trust in him. See, Matthew is all about showing that Jesus is the fulfillment of all the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah. And that's what's happening here. Now, I think it's worth maybe discussing the sea a little bit further. So before I said that it's the Sea of Galilee is actually a big lake. And while that's technically true, I think using the term sea is good. I think it's no coincidence that the Jews called it a sea. And because of all the incredible things that happened there, the fact that they called it a sea ties it into the scripture so well for us. So throughout all history, including in the Bible, the sea it's a dangerous place. It's filled with the unknown, terrifying creatures. Think about Jonah, right? It's filled with spirits. It's filled with little g gods. The Romans thought there was a god of the sea, and so there's a sense of foreboding when you're talking about big bodies of water like this. Even today, sailing is a dangerous vocation. Now, most of these guys are fishermen. They know very well how dangerous it is to be out there. And they also know all the superstitions and the stories, of what goes on out there in the night. Incidentally, they're going to be out there in the dark in the night. I mean, have you ever seen Deadliest Catch, right? I mean, I think in this story, these disciples really could film an episode themselves. So let's kind of see what happens next. So if I move on into verse 25. And in the fourth watch of the night, that's sometime between 3 and 6 a.m., he came to them, talking about Jesus, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, and they said, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Now that section right there, that's going to be the focus of what we talk about, because that's really where we get into the heart of the matter. Now, their first response when they see him walk, I mean, think about what would your first response be, right? Their first response is probably what any sailor who saw that would say. They said, "Oh, and the Greek is phantasma. It means a spirit, a ghost. It means they saw a ghost." And there's the phrase, they cried out in fear. And it's written, it's kind of in unison as one. They kind of, they all yelled. And I think it could kind of be interpreted that they freaked out. I think that's what it's trying to tell us there, is they freaked out. But I do want to take just a quick second, and I want to look at what these guys are doing, right? So they're rowing, and they've been rowing against a headwind all night long in dangerous waters. Why would they do that? Why not like turn around and wait for it to pass? That's what I would have done. And I think the answer is this. It's because Jesus told them to. And that's obedience. They were obedient. I got to give credit where credit is due. They were obedient. But their obedience, it was their obedience that put them exactly where Jesus intended for them to be. So I'm going to keep moving here. So I'm going to skip into Mark, and I'm going to give you what he says in verse 48. Mark's chapter 6, verse 48. And he, Jesus, saw. Now Jesus is on a mountain praying, and they're miles out into the lake, into the sea. Jesus saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. He's miles away on a mountain praying, but his eye was on them in their obedience. And then Jesus went for a walk. And when he gets to him, this, like, what he says is critical. He says this. He says, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Now for the disciples, these are good Hebrews, and they know their scriptures, right? And I think maybe for them, and I think what happens later kind of proves this out, what happened there when Jesus used those words, it's an aha moment. It's an aha theological moment for them. They are witnessing prophecy being fulfilled, because what Jesus says in Greek is, "It is I," and that's ego eimi. And that is, in Greek, the covenant name for God. In Hebrew, it's Yahweh, I am. We get that in Exodus 3:14. Jesus in that moment states, "I am," when he says, "It is I." It's not a greeting. It is a claim of deity. And Matthew's audience is going to be Jewish. Besides us, the people who Matthew is writing this for are Jewish people. And they're going to immediately recognize that this is a fulfillment of the Old Testament. Let's look at Job, okay? In Job 9, Job's in the middle of kind of giving a diatribe on all the incredible aspects of God. I'm going to pick up in verse 5. He's been talking about God who does these things. He says in verse 5, "Which removeth the mountains, and they know not, which overturneth them in his anger, which shaketh the earth out of her place, and the pillars thereof tremble, which commandeth the sun, and it riseth not, and sealeth up the stars, which alone spreadeth out the heavens, and treadeth upon the waves of the sea." Job just said only God can tread the waves of the sea. Jesus has just declared by saying, "I am," and being standing there walking on the water. He has declared and he has shown he is not just a miracle worker. He is not just a healer or a rabbi. He is God. So I'm going to keep going in Job 9. This is in verse, I think it's verse 11. "Lo, he goeth by me, and I see him not. He passeth on also, but I perceive him not." That's King James. I'm going to read this out of ESV. "Behold, he passes by me, and I see him not. He moves on, but I do not perceive him." What does that mean, he passes by me? And it turns out I think Mark can actually help us solve that a little bit. This is in Mark 6, verse 48. "And he saw they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea." We've gotten that far in Matthew. But then Mark says, "He meant to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified." Mark tells us Jesus goes for this walk to meet these guys in the boat, and he meant to pass them by. Well, what does that mean? Like, why would you walk and just pass them by? But the truth is, Jesus intended to pass them by to reveal his divine glory and to identify to them who he is, echoing the Old Testament. Because what Mark is saying there echoes what we read about Moses and Elijah when God passed by them. The action is designed to show them that he is in control. He's doing it to teach them, to strengthen their faith, because they're coming off of a moment where, after the miraculous feeding of the 5,000, there's some disillusionment there, right? They're not really maybe understanding everything that's going on. And the phrase "pass by" in Greek is parakomai, and it connects to a theophany, a visible manifestation of God, like when God passed before Moses in Exodus 33 and 34. Jesus saw them struggling, and he went to them in their distress to teach them that he is God and he is in control of the storm. Now, the incident, it addresses the disciples' lack of understanding regarding the previous miracles, but it helps them recognize that he's not a ghost, he's the Son of God. And now, when we read about Jesus walking on the water, the Old Testament kind of starts to come alive with pictures of him, right? So, a couple that I'll share, this is Psalm 77. I'm going to start in verse 16. The waters saw thee, O God, the waters saw thee, they were afraid. The depths also were troubled. The clouds poured out water, the skies sent out a sound, thine arrows also went abroad. The voice of thy thunder was in the heaven, the lightnings lightened the world, the earth trembled and shook. Thy way is in the sea, and thy path in the great waters, and thy footsteps are not known. Do you think that popped into their head maybe when they realized what was going on? How about Psalm 107, picking up in verse 23? They that go down to the sea in ships, that do business in great waters, these see the works of the Lord, and his wonders in the deep. For he commandeth and raiseth the stormy wind, which lifteth up the waves thereof. They mount up to the heaven, they go down to the depths. He's describing someone on riding in a boat on huge seas. Their soul is melted because of trouble. They reel to and fro, and stagger like a drunken man, and are at their wits' end. I think he's kind of describing where the disciples might have been. And then they cry unto the Lord in their trouble, and he bringeth them out of their distresses. He maketh the storm a calm, so that the waves thereof are still. Then are they glad, because they be quiet. So he bringeth them unto their desired haven. And that's exactly what happens. So here's the crux of the matter. We're talking about fear. We're talking about courage. Fear is the cousin of unbelief. And what cancels unbelief? Belief. So what cancels fear? Belief in the one true God. Do you know what the most common command in the Bible is? We're told it's like 365 times. That's not really true. It's about 70 some odd times, I think. Maybe as many as 100, depending on translation. But the most common command in the Bible is, do not be afraid, fear not, do not fear. So let's take a look at somebody that puts that into action, okay? Picking back up in Matthew 14, verse 28. And Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. He said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And then verse 33. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. See, when Peter took his gaze off Jesus, when he took his eyes off Jesus, and he fixated rather on his situation, he started to sink. Now, there's a pretty good lesson just right there. But I don't want to do Peter dirty and leave him with this image of a guy of little faith. I mean, after all, he was the only one that was willing to step out of the boat. So I give him some credit for that. All of what Jesus did in this passage comes to fruition in verse 33. Everything was pointing to this. These men learned and believed who Jesus is. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. Now let's go and take a look in John 6, and let's find out what happens next, okay? So in John 6, we find out the crowd chases them down to Capernaum, but they've got bad motives. All the crowd really wanted from Jesus was another free meal. They were looking for a political leader who would provide them with a life of freebies and laziness. And I think we might say we have the same problem in the world today. So John 6, picking up in 25. When they found him on the other side of the sea, so they followed him across to Capernaum. When they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you come here? And Jesus answered them, truly, truly, I say to you, you are seeking me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give to you. For on him God the Father has set his seal. Jesus is going to go on and tell this crowd and the disciples and the Pharisees and everybody else in attendance that he is the bread of life. And long story short, they didn't like what he was putting down. So I'll skip ahead to verse 66. After this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. And that's after all that Jesus has done. They didn't like the message that he had given them at the last there. And so they turned their back on him and they walked away. How sad. And Jesus turns to the 12 and he says, do you want to go away too? And here's Peter, that guy that was about to sink in the water, stepping up. And he says, Lord, to whom shall we go? Where are we going to go? You have the words of eternal life. And we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God. I think they might have learned some courage. So how do we wrap this up? What does this mean for us? Jesus sends the apostles out on the sea without him. And he, unbeknownst to them, is interceding for them, and his eye was on them. And when the wind stirred up the waves, the troubles, Jesus knew exactly where they were, and he went to them there. And he tells them, take courage. Why? Because I am with you. I am Yahweh. The creator of the universe is with you. Skipping ahead to Matthew 28, verse 20. And behold, he says, I am with you always to the end of the age. And that is the definition of courage. When you're struggling, take your eyes off of the situation and put it on him. I know sometimes that's easier said than done. It was for Peter. Anyway, here's some verses that'll maybe help you bring it on home for your class. This is Hebrews 12, verses 1 through 12. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. And here's James 1:6. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. Well, that's kind of how I'm going to wrap it up. I've got a few discussion questions you might could share with your class, and kind of after you finish up and sort of recap. Here's one. How does Jesus' walk on water specifically serve as a regal, royal display of his deity rather than just another miracle? What does Peter's experience teach us about the difference between little faith and no faith? And I think Jesus said something about the faith as small as a mustard seed, right? And why does Jesus allow us to reach our extremity before intervening? And then what was it about this specific encounter in the fourth watch of the night that finally convinced the disciples of Jesus' true essence? Well, I hope some of this might help you with some direction and maybe some references for your own class. And, I thank you all for your commitment to your class and to our church. So let's remember to pray for one another, pray for our community, for our country, and for the world. God bless you all and have a good week.